Subject that has been a lot in the news recently has been state of prisons. Um, I was going to upload a video about the Joe Cox trial and also the trial of Stephen Port, who has been a serial killer operating in East London. I might still make that video. Those cases are not connected really at all, but they were both high-profile cases that the outcome was on the same day yesterday. Um, So I was going to make a video about that, but actually, if I try to encompass that into this video, it's just going to get too messy and too much subject matter. So I'll stay tuned for a video on those subjects. I want to talk about the state of prisons in England and Wales and some of the issues around this. Not long ago, there were reports of a serious riot in Bedford Prison, and like many British prisons, it's a Victorian prison as I understand it. And one of the issues there was overcrowding. I don't know about any reports of how many inmates or guards were injured, but by all accounts, it was a pretty serious riot. There are currently in excess of 80,000 inmates in the UK, which I believe gives us the highest prison population in Europe, not including Russia, but certainly within Western Europe. And this has been a source of great debate. Now, I have to say, I believe that prison, with its intention, with its main purpose of, well, really multiple purposes in its purest sense, is not a bad thing. Number one, if you have violent people who are terrorizing society, prison serves a purpose of keeping them incarcerated, hence protecting the public. It also serves a purpose of consequences for actions, i.e., for committing crime. And also, in its ideal mode, prison should serve as a basis for rehabilitation for sentences which don't carry a whole life tariff. Now, obviously, those are all ideal. That's not quite the reality. In this country, we do have a high reoffending rate, unfortunately. In terms of crime statistics, that's something that's always a little bit controversial because it depends what sources you look at. So, for example, the government may say that overall crime is down. Any government might say that, and it might actually be the case. But there could be a range of factors. It could be that more people are reporting crime, which is a good thing. Um, Incidentally, that could also make crime look like it's spiking. If more people are reporting it, doesn't necessarily mean that the situation is getting more violent or dangerous. This is another area I believe the media has huge responsibility. It is important that the media cover serious crimes, but I also believe it is equally important that they don't scaremonger. And I do believe that where there is a heightened fear of crime, the tabloids have some responsibility. I mean, if they have a choice of two headlines that say number of overall assaults has fallen in the last budget year, versus I don't know, 81-year-old pensioner viciously beaten up by gang of yobs. They're going to choose the latter because it's going to get more people's attention. They know that sort of story will really tap into people's emotions and work people up. So I do think the press, especially the tabloid press, are culpable in rising fears of crime. I don't, in terms of the current situation, I don't feel particularly unsafe. I live in a reasonably decent neighbourhood. My city, actually, Sunderland, actually is among the lower end of the scale in terms of crimes, according to the last Home Office figures I saw. Anyway, there's certain Midland cities that have higher crime rates than Sunderland, and that surprises a few people because Sunderland's one of those places that kind of, it's on the wrong end of jokes usually. But Sunderland is not particularly dangerous city. It's the sort of place where we don't have serious gang problems because we're not big enough, but it's kind of a rough seaside place, and it's always been that way. In terms of, it's just tradition. Wherever you have a port city, there tends to be there is a rough culture, if I could put it that way. I know that's not the most eloquent way to put it, but it's true of every port city in the world. But the point is, the fear of crime and actual crime statistics are obviously not the same thing. Also, And this is extremely important, and it's something that I think isn't spoken about enough. If someone is a victim of a crime, especially if it's a violent crime, that is definitely going to impact their thinking on the subject. If you have just been mugged by a gang of thugs, obviously you're going to think that the situation is really bad. But it could just be that you're the one unlucky person that it happens to, and the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people doesn't happen to. So I do also believe that personal experience. I mean, I remember when I suffered, my family suffered problems with local gangs, or at least local yobs. These weren't organized gangs in the American sense, but they were still, you know, it was still a very unpleasant experience. Serious antisocial behavior made our lives a misery, to be quite honest. But that sort of experience definitely had an impact on me, and it shaped my views on crime ever since. But one of the effects it did have at the time was, as a 16-year-old, I sat there in my house thinking, this is out of control. And I thought the whole situation in the country was out of control. But it just so happened that I happened to live in a rough area at that time and I had a bad experience. That doesn't mean the whole situation in Britain was out of control at that time. And I think that's what people have to understand. Of course, I would never tell a victim of crime that, because I totally understand it. But that is the case. Personal experience can cloud people's judgment on these things. Anyway, back to prison. Um, I was reading Cameron on Cameron. This is a sort of interview format biography of David Cameron. It was published when he was opposition leader in 2008. I've just read the segment on prisons, and he visited Wandsworth, which at the time was one of Europe's largest prisons, probably still is. It's a Victorian panopticon style prison, which basically means it's laid out like you have a central chamber and then branches out going to the various cells. Well, certainly the accounts the author gives, the author is Dylan Jones, um, is that that was in a bad state. There was virtually no control over drugs coming in and out. It was overcrowded. There was a trade in illegal mobile phone use, which of course meant that drug deals could be done. And he painted a pretty grim picture. Now, whether the situation is better or worse, I don't know. What David Cameron proposed at that time was creating 5,000 more prison places. I don't know if the Tories managed to do that or not. I haven't done my research on that, but I believe that is probably a practical approach. Common sense dictates that if you have a prison that is designed for 800 inmates and you have 1,200, for example, that is going to lead to frictions. Um, and I also think punitive measures like banning smoking in prisons is just stupid. I don't think that is sensible at all. So clearly, overcrowding is a problem. Now, social left wingers, especially, and social liberals say, oh, well, the answer is to send fewer people to jail. I'm not convinced that is the answer. I believe that where serious crimes have been committed, people should go to jail. I believe that community sentencing has its place. I do believe community sentencing has a role. But if you have a serial shoplifter who has done it dozens of times, and that's not an exaggeration. In some cases, that really is the case. And they literally laugh at the prospect of another community sentence. Clearly, the consequence has to be elevated. So I do believe prison has a place, and nor do I believe it should just be for violent offences. There are some non-violent offences. They're technically non-violent. It doesn't mean they're trivial. Take, for example, if you have a con artist who has robbed a pensioner of his or her life savings, it may not involve any actual violence, but it is a heinous crime that can devastate someone's life. So I don't agree that just because a crime's non-violent, it's automatically trivial. That's another mistake liberals often make by talking about so-called trivial crimes. I don't believe there's any such thing as a trivial crime. All crimes have consequences on society. Um, Certainly, every crime against a person does. You know, everything from shoplifting, because then the shopkeeper has to replenish your stock, right up to the most serious cases like serious assault or homicide, um, arson. You know, the most serious sort of crimes. So I don't believe the answer is send fewer people to jail. I know there are some legal experts advising that, but legal experts often are motivated purely by statistics and the technical side of things. They don't care about the human emotive side of things. In other words, victims' closure. Um, so practically, send fewer people to prison. That means there'll be fewer prison riots. Yeah, that would probably be the case. I still don't think it's the right approach because, like I say, if people commit serious crimes, they should face consequences. So I think Cameron's approach there of building more prison places is probably the answer. It's not, there's no easy outcome because when you build more prison places, people living near prisons are going to complain about it. But I still think it's a utilitarian choice. If it's a choice of some people living near prisons complaining or the wider population benefiting, I go with the wider population. Um, I think if you live near an airport or you live near a prison, you need to take into account that's what it is. If I'm going to live in an area, I I do my homework as to where it's going to be, and I don't think people can really turn around and say, "Oh, I'm complaining about this prison that's been here since 1853." Well, you chose to move to the area. It's the prison has to be somewhere. That's kind of the outlook I take. Um, so prisons themselves, I wouldn't have time in one video to go through every single thing that would make an ideal prison. Um, there are many who point to the Nordic model. I'm not convinced by the Nordic model, and this is why. Firstly, they will say, well, look at Nordic crime rates are very low. Um, that may be the case. And I say may be the case because I believe there are certain crimes in the Nordics countries that are not necessarily reported, especially, and this is going to be politically incorrect, but especially, and this has been proven recently, crimes committed by migrants. In the case of Sweden, there was around the same time as the Cologne attacks, crimes committed by migrants in the city of Malmo. Now, the local police actually advised the press not to report that in case, in their view, it inflamed racial tensions. In other words, they're underreporting crimes committed by ethnic minorities because, oh, it's progressive Sweden, we can't say anything negative because that would be racist. So, when certain Scandinavians try to make out that their system is utopian and it's perfect, I'm not so convinced that it is. Clearly, it's a lot better than some systems. I mean, the other extreme would be if you look at the case of some Southeast Asian countries, take the Philippines, for instance, where there's massive overcrowding that makes the British situation look like a picnic. That's clearly a recipe for disaster. I also believe the American system is nothing to shout about because you have, um, violent crime rates in the US are much higher than other developed countries. They have the largest incarceration rate in the world. And I do think in the US system there are certain offences that, I mean, when you put a 16-year-old who's doing, pot in with serious gang members, that is clearly stupid. And where there are examples of something similar happening in the UK, that obviously needs to be reviewed. So the truth is, there is no ideal model anywhere in the world. I don't accept the Scandinavian argument when they point to their system. The other thing I resent about the Scandinavian model is I don't think it's proportionate. When you have, I believe, in the city of Gothenburg in the 90s, there was a case with serious arson, and somewhere in the region of 60 people were killed. It was a major incident. The perpetrators got less than 10 years because they were teenagers at the time. Less than 10 years. Now, to me, that is just perverse. That is not justice. Um, so I remember also the time of the Oslo massacre and the Norwegian massacre. There was a lot of discussion about the punishment for Anders Breivik. Believe it or not, his sentence was actually quite tough by Norwegian standards. It's the closest they have to a whole life tariff. But I basically take the view that prisons need to get the balance as accurate as they possibly can. They should not be universities of crime. It should not be a case where they are so brutal, where people go in and they just come out more bitter. And in the case of Belmarsh, there was a situation where you had young Muslim inmates coming in for, let's say, regular offences, so called, and they would come out actually radicalized because they would be allowed to be in contact with Islamists. And that is a very serious problem because there is a disproportionate number of Muslim inmates in proportion to the population. So that's something that needs to be looked at, to how much young people can be subject to being radicalized. Um, I personally believe hate preachers should be put in solitary confinement. They need to, that is just reckless, putting them in with young impressionable inmates who will come out as potential terrorists, basically. So they go in as a shoplifter, they come out as a potential terrorist. That's clearly something that needs to be reviewed, and I'm sure the government is working on that. Sometimes people don't see what's going on behind closed doors, and the government gets heavily criticised. Maybe it's not entirely fair. Anyway, I don't want to see prisons being universities of crime where inmates come out more brutal. I don't want to see a situation where you have inmates being bullied and I don't know what the prison term is. So, like in the army, you get new recruits who are hazed, so-called initiation ceremonies. I don't want to see a situation where new inmates are beaten up on their first night, etc. There needs to be a zero tolerance policy. That's why I actually take the view that when you get incendiary gutter rags like the Sun, um, they would, for example, report on a sensitive case. No wonder you're going to get a riot. If they report there's a particularly sensitive case, where there's been a particularly awful crime committed, and then the inmates are reading that, then they go and kill or beat up the person who has done that terrible crime. I, it's one of the many hypocrisies of the tabloid press. If tabloid newspapers were to ban from prisons, they would yell about free speech, and yet they're the very people that supposedly take a hard line on crime, but they don't mind criminals buying the rags, so or having access to the rags. I do believe that when you have reckless reporting, it's inevitably going to fuel, and I'm not saying this is the whole case, but it is going to fuel some tensions inside. If you have, for example, sensitive cases, especially around child crimes and so on, and at this point, I want to be clear, I have no sympathy with such people, but I do believe that prisons should be ordered. Well, it doesn't help, say, if you have a shoplifter, some people will say, oh, it's good that he beats up the paedophile. Well, all you're doing there is saying that it's one scumbag beating up a bigger scumbag. Okay, it doesn't teach the first person that their crime is wrong, just allowing them to do something like that. So I do believe that prisons should have zero tolerance to any sort of targeting of any inmate. I believe that sex offenders should have some of the harshest um, sentences, and I believe they should definitely pay for the crimes. But you have to have order inside. If you allow inmates to feel that they could do whatever they want and run the place, then it's going to be crazy. One of the interesting things about this account that Cameron gave, or Dylan Jones gave, was that the ratios of guards was actually very high. It was something like for every two inmates there was one guard. That's a very high ratio. So it didn't appear to be a shortage in manpower. Um, he did say that some of the guards are puny, not his words exactly, but um, I think you need a situation where, firstly, it goes without saying, you need tough people working in the prison service. You need people. I actually would propose ex-soldiers. I would have no problem with that because you need people who are hardy, who can control the situation, who aren't afraid to stand up to inmates. And I'm not bad mouthing prison guards; they have a tough job, but I do wonder sometimes, do they let a lot of things go because it becomes a situation where the inmates take control. And that is the worst situation, I think, in a prison. From day one, inmates need to know their place and know that they're there for a reason. If I was a prison governor, and I know this is easier said than done, but if I was a prison governor, I would say on day one, I am God, do not fuck with me. Sorry to be theatrical, but I think that is the sort of approach that's needed. In other words, someone who is feared, but also respected. I honestly believe in that. You cannot have a namby-pamby governor who's going to just give inmates what they want for good behaviour or anything like that. But by the same token, you cannot have a sadist. You cannot have someone who enjoys punishing inmates just for the sake of it. You need a hard approach which gets the balance right. Now, liberals will complain, oh, but that's inconsistent. So would conservatives. They would say that's inconsistent. It's not. I think it's perfectly compatible to argue in tough but humane. That's not incompatible. In other words, you have a situation where inmates have access to healthcare if they need it. If they're dying from some horrible disease or something, a humane treatment would be that they have access to healthcare, um, that they have exercise, that they have square meals, etc. But they should not have perks that law-abiding members of the public have. So they shouldn't get Sky Television. They shouldn't get. I don't think they should get newspapers. They shouldn't get. They can have books, but not newspapers. So there needs to be a balance. There really does. But there should be a zero tolerance to bullying. Say, for example, you have someone inside for a white supremacist hate crime. It's going to be very stupid putting them in with an ethnic minority inmate. Or likewise, if you have a black supremacist, putting them in with a white inmate. Clearly stupid. Putting an Islamist in with a Jewish inmate, etc. There has to be common sense involved in this. And there are no easy answers, but I do believe the situation can improve. Now, I'm going to round this up quite soon because I've spoken at length. Obviously, there's a lot to cover. I don't believe there's going to be a perfect situation anytime soon, but I am an absolute staunch believer that where there is a crime, there has to be consequences. And I just don't accept that arguing for punishment is somehow wanting revenge. It pisses me off when neoliberals say that. Like, if you want to see someone punished for their crime, oh, you just want revenge. No, I want to see justice. If I wanted revenge, or if people wanted revenge, then the exact same thing would happen to the inmate. Um, so, in short, there needs to be a situation where inmates go in and they know that they're there for a reason, face the consequences, they do their time, but they don't come out more bitter. Now, no one has a magic formula to that, but certainly there can be some approaches taken. Overcrowding is obviously an issue. I also think that punitive petty punishments have no place. So forbidding smoking over Christmas is just stupid. That doesn't help anyone. So I wouldn't propose that. But like I say, there should be a restriction on liberties. Because the whole point of going to prison is that your liberty is taken away, or at least some of it is taken away. And that's something that the left, certain members of the left, I should say, don't get. So when they say, "Oh, prison should just be about stopping reoffending," I disagree. That's a major part of it. But prison punishment is part of it. It is. Okay, you cannot have justice without punishment. You just can't. It's an oxymoron to say that someone's committed a terrible crime and they're just going to be told, "Oh, you've been a bad boy or a bad girl. Don't do it again." Or we're going to listen to your sob story that you had a rough time from your father or your parents were divorced or whatever it is. Therefore, we're going to tell you that it's all society's fault and we feel sorry for you and we're going to give you a tap on the wrist and give you a big hug then. Oh, please don't commit that crime again. I think that's a lot of nonsense. Everyone is responsible for their own actions. And incidentally, there are people who have had very challenging backgrounds don't resort to crime. People say poverty results in crime. Sorry, I'm trying to get the right light. Well, that's an insult to people on the lower end of the economic scale because it slanders them as all being potential criminals. It's a bit like when mental health issues is used as an excuse. Certainly, it is a major issue, and probably there's a much higher proportion of mental illness among inmates than the general population. But again, you have to be careful there because when it is used, I had an argument yesterday with someone who tried to say that Thomas Mayer, the man who murdered Joe Cox, he tried to sort of use that as an issue. The problem with bringing mental health into it is it kind of gives a green light. You can use mental health for any crime, for any sort of act of terrorism, but that then slanders people who have mental health conditions. It adds to the stigma, and it implies that everyone with mental health problems is a potential criminal. That's why I have a problem with it. And having mental health issues doesn't necessarily mean someone isn't aware of their own actions. Someone can be bad and mad at the same time, actually. So, yeah, I'm going to round this up. I've spoken for quite a long time. Sorry about all the moving around. There's few issues that touch the public nerve as much as crime. There's a few others, immigration, the EU, but crime is definitely one that is very near the top that really, really touches a raw nerve with people, understandably so. And I don't think we'll ever have a perfect situation. There will always be crime. There will always be selfish people who don't care about others and who are prepared to hurt others. But as a civilized society, we need to try to get the approach right. There has to be consequences. If for one reason, I know from experience that as a victim, it is harder to get closure when the person responsible is not facing proportionate justice. But it shouldn't be a brutal system. It shouldn't be that they go into hellhole prisons where they're going to be raped on the first night and it's just a jungle. It shouldn't be like that either. And there's no easy answers. I'm just not convinced that either the Nordic model, which focuses, in my view, too much on feeling sorry for the criminals, or the US model, which focuses too much on incarceration and I think fosters gang culture. They're both extremes. Trying to get the middle ground is the best. Now, we're not the worst situation in the world, but we can definitely improve. Um, so that's it. I would be interested, incidentally, looking at the model of some Far East countries, maybe Japan or South Korea, because there appears to be, and I don't know about this, but there appears to be a very low level of prison disturbances, or at least they seem to have a pretty ordered system. I don't know. I need to look more into it. But they're ordered without going down the Scandinavian route. They're also pretty hard line. So I don't know. That's something I might look more into. See what sort of approach they take. I'm not saying I approve of all the Japanese sort of. I mean, they, for example, have a situation where relatives of the condemned are not allowed to speak to them and so on. I think that's a bit callous. But yeah, that's it. Let me know your thoughts. This has been a longer video, but the issues are very, very important. There are no easy answers. I don't propose to know everything, but having having put up with gangs for months on end, I know the emotional side of this, and I'm like everyone. I want to see a safer society, but I do want to see people who terrorize others held to account. I really do, and those who say that there shouldn't be punishment, I think they're deluded.